My name is Estelle. It's really great to be here today. I am all the way from Aotearoa, New Zealand, so I flew a very long way to be here. And I study at the University of Canterbury, where I recently submitted my PhD investigating people in New Zealand who microdose with psychedelics. And I came to this from a psychology and philosophy background, so this was my first time in pharmacy, so it was a very cool project to be a part of. Cool. I just want to briefly thank my project supervisors and also the funding that allowed me to be here today, particularly the Claude McCarthy Fellowship, which funded my travel over here. Very expensive to get here from New Zealand. And then just an overview of what I want to go over today. So I'll be going over illicit drugs and the law and how drug laws can cause harm and how they can limit research. I'll be talking about the drug checking legislation in New Zealand and how this was put in place to address harm caused by illicit drugs. And then I'll also be talking about how we harness that for psychedelic microdosing research. So drug laws in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I just want to briefly say, if I call New Zealand Aotearoa, it's the Māori name for New Zealand, and Māori are the indigenous population of New Zealand. And so in New Zealand, as well as many other jurisdictions, we specify multiple substances as controlled, and this does include psychedelics. We have the ABC system, and so A is perceived as the most harmful with the least therapeutic benefit. Unfortunately, psychedelics fall into this. And then it's B and C, which are perceived as least harmful. And I just want to mention the Misuse of Drugs Act is now 50 years old, and many, including myself, believe it needs a massive update. But anyway, that's a whole separate talk. But that's the state of things in New Zealand, at least. And then the possession and use of controlled substances might mean that people are criminalised and if authorities detect these substances being used by people. So drug laws are responsible for harm. Why? Because manufacturers and distributors of illicit substances are not under any sort of regulation or quality control. So people are buying substances thinking they're getting one thing when in fact they might actually be getting another. And this does risk people consuming dangerous substances. So in worst case scenarios, this has led to psychological harm, hospitalisation and even death. So drug laws also can limit research because in New Zealand at least legal barriers mean that it's only those in like the police or customs that can possess or work with these substances. If they were analysed with research, they might not necessarily be representative of what is going around on the illicit market in communities of people who use drugs. Consequently, we can't study what people are actually using. So drug checking came in as a legislative response in New Zealand to address harm caused by illicit drugs. Basically, it allows people who are using a substance or wanting to use a substance obtained illicitly to go into a clinic and have a small portion of that substance tested, and then the likely identity of that substance is told to them, and there's a harm reduction conversation around that as well. And it's all completely free, legal and confidential. And drug checking happens across the globe, but New Zealand is the first place that actually introduced a legislation for it. So that was pretty cool. And here are some organisations that do drug checking and harm reduction. They do it at festivals and clinics throughout the country. Every week people can go in and have substances tested. And I just want to say I also personally work at some of these organisations, and it's a really cool community of people, and it's cool to really see harm reduction happening in the flesh. So just some examples of how drug checking has helped inform the public of potentially harmful substances going around. A few years ago in New Zealand, there was a substance going around, an N-bomb being sold as LSD, and this can have similar effects to LSD, but can cause like psychological, physiological harms as well. And then High Alert is New Zealand's early warning system for dangerous drugs. It's supported by government and non-governmental organisations, but this information goes out to the public. There's some pretty surprising examples. These are just a few. For example, recently there was cocaine being sold, which wasn't actually cocaine, it was heroin. So obviously they're quite different things. And there's just some statistics there. So between 11 and 19% of substances by two of the organisations that do drug checking, found that 11 and 19 to 19% of substances were not what people thought. So it just shows. Oh, okay. Cool. So how does drug checking techniques work? I won't go too much into the detail about this, but the main technique that's used is Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. And what this is basically is a small sample of a substance is put on a diamond, which infrared light picks up as a spectra, and it's a unique spectra like a fingerprint for the substance, and it's compared to libraries of other spectra in the database. We also, in drug checking, use reagents. So there's lots of different reagents, and particular ones mixed with different chemicals, showing if a drug is present or not in a sample by a colour change. For example, with LSD, what will happen, so the LSD specific one is called Ehrlich's reagent. And so what happens with that is you drop a little bit on, for example, a blotter tab, and a colour change will indicate if LSD is present. It usually goes like a blue, purple colour. Another thing used are test strips. These test for particular substances, such as in New Zealand, the most common ones used in drug checking at the moment are for potent opioids, fentanyl and nitazines. So I want to sidestep a bit here to psychedelic microdosing, and I swear this will all tie together very soon. So psychedelic microdosing, I'm sure everyone knows what it is because we're at a psychedelics conference, right? But just in case anyone doesn't know, it's the practice of taking small subhallucinogenic amounts of psychedelic substances. And when I say subhallucinogenic, I mean no consciousness-altering effects. And so why do people do it then? Well, there's purported benefits to well-being, cognition, creativity. This has become quite a popular practice among people in the psychedelic sphere, but clinical trials and research is only really just catching up to this popularity. So tying drug checking together with psychedelic microdosing, there's a lot of research that is observational, self-report, looking at people microdosing in communities and psychological benefits and things, but this research assumes people are taking what they think, and knowing what we know about illicit drugs, sometimes not being what people think, this is a big assumption. And so there's also other factors, especially for small doses like microdoses, that could cause variability. There's no scientific consensus on how one can prepare a dose or the best way to take it or time of day. There's no consensus on that yet. It's a lot of anecdotes, and that adds significant variability. Also variations in, for example, how a sample is stored, the age of the sample, all those sorts of things might affect the composition of a sample. So there's a gap in the literature with psychedelic microdosing here, in that no research had ever collected data on what people were actually using, and they hadn't actually ever collected substances of what people were using and analysed these. So we thought, okay, this is a gap in the literature that we can address with my research. And because drug checking legislation is a thing in New Zealand and it's legal to do it, can we harness this legislation to do this research? So this was one part of my whole PhD project, which was quite a large project. I wish I could go through it all today. And I'll give some more context to it soon, and it'll be brief, so if anything doesn't make sense, feel free to just ask me later. Anyway, getting back to drug checking. So the legislation was actually designed for service providers, so those walk-in clinics I was talking about, it wasn't designed for research, and so it was very difficult for us to get a license, and I'm not going to go through this, and I don't expect you to read it all, but I just want to say this is only a very brief timeline of how long and how many steps it went through for us to get this license. For service providers with those walk-in clinics, it usually takes 3 to 4 months. For us, it took a whole year to get the license, so it very much held up my research, but we got it in the end. And one thing that made it take so long is because there was a lot of adjustments that had to be made to apply the legislation to a university context and a study context where clients weren't just walking in and receiving their advice and going. There were lots of different study measures that were happening throughout my research. So just to give a little bit of context for my larger project, so it just makes sense a little bit. So I did recruit both online and in-person microdoses, and also people who were not microdosing for a comparison between people who were microdosing and who weren't. And I looked at other things like demographics, some psychological factors, how people were microdosing. I also wanted to see if there was a difference in psychological factors between a day someone was microdosing and a day that they were not, so within groups comparison. And also whether there were any differences between people who were consuming a substance that they knew that it matched their expectations, and consuming a substance where it did not match their expectations. So for the drug checking methods we used, all participants, as per legislative requirements, had to remain completely anonymous. This made it really difficult when people were doing multiple online measures as well as multiple in-person visits, so people were asked to come in for 2 visits. And we were like, well, people might not necessarily remember their unique ID, and so how are we going to link them across methods or different measures? So what we came up with, that some past literature did, was a unique ID generation questionnaire. So at the start of each measure, people would answer questions such as what's the second letter of the name of your first pet, and then all the answers to those questions created a unique code. So at the start of every measure, people created the same code. So that helped link data. And then also, participants came in for 2 visits. They were instructed to provide a sample on the first visit or the second visit, and we asked them to provide 1 or 2 samples of a pre-prepared microdose or more if they wanted. And then there was a lot of by-the-book rules we had to follow when weighing, storing, etc. As part of the legislation, which took up a lot of time, but we managed to do it in the end, and we had a lot of audits, but it all worked out, which was really cool. So methods for how we analysed the LSD samples. So we got most of these in blotter form, actually. So using Ehrlich's reagent wasn't really an option. As I mentioned before, Ehrlich's reagent is that method where you drop a portion of a liquid on the tab and it changes colour if LSD is present. But because we had such small samples, we couldn't really compromise a whole sample, and cutting off a tiny bit wasn't quite enough. And so we didn't use this. We also, as per the legislation, had to use FTIR, but FTIR does not work for blotter tabs, it just shows up as paper. So the main method we used, which was approved by the drug checking government team, was HPLC, and HPLC separates, identifies and quantifies compounds in a liquid form. So extracts of the LSD blotters were created. For psilocybin, again, FTIR as a legislative requirement, we had to use it. And it actually doesn't work for dried mushroom samples because it just comes up as like flour or cornstarch. So we looked at some past literature and looking at extractions from dried mushroom material, and we followed this method and created our own extraction protocol. We had to get pure psilocybin and psilocin standards as comparisons, and after the whole extraction protocol was created, we used liquid chromatography mass spectrometry to analyse the samples. So what this is it basically combines HPLC's separation capabilities with the sensitive analysis capabilities of mass spectrometry. I'm not going to go through this, and I don't expect you to read it, but it's just an example of how complicated the extraction protocol was before we even got to the LCMS stage. It took months to smooth this out because the past papers we were looking at the methods didn't even really work for us. There were lots of little things that weren't working, and so finally we got there in the end. But it was quite complicated. So results. The research I did that was online started in October 2022, and then the in-person component started in June 2023, and it wrapped up around this time last year. And in total, it was 105 New Zealanders who indicated they were currently microdosing. I suspect this number is a lot more, but people might have been scared to come forward, even in an anonymous survey, to say that they were using a Class A substance, which is understandable, given the penalties. I obtained 27 samples of potential psychedelic microdoses, as we'll see soon. 10 presumed LSD, 17 presumed psilocybin in various different forms. And as we'll see soon, LSD outcomes was surprisingly quite consistent. Psilocybin, not so much. I also just want to show this. This is from both my online and in-person data. So almost 3/4 of people in New Zealand indicated they were using mushrooms, and then the other quarter indicated they were using LSD, and there were a few other substances reported there. That's interesting because in a lot of the global literature generally, in not all cases, but you tend to see a sort of 50-50 split of people using LSD and psilocybin for microdosing. So New Zealanders just really love their mushrooms, I guess. So these are some real LSD samples, or presumed LSD samples, that participants provided to me. And so all of them were consistent with LSD, except for that last one highlighted in blue there. That was a peach vodka dilution that someone had made. And whether or not it didn't contain LSD in the first place, or if it had degraded in the solution, we don't know. And putting blotters in vodka as a way of dosing is quite a common method, so it's interesting to see that it didn't contain any LSD. And a lot of people didn't know their dose, except for the fourth one down there, which was actually surprisingly consistent with what the person thought they were taking. And these are real mushroom samples that we got. So you'll notice, just to say 0.18 grams is a common dose. That's because one person did give me a lot of samples, which was awesome. And so you can see there that the percentages of psilocin and psilocybin really varied, and I'll put this in context soon. But yeah, there was variation from like 1.7% to almost 9% psilocybin and psilocin within samples. And here are some more. So those first three there showed, again, a wide variety of psilocybin, psilocin. The last two only showed psilocin, interestingly. I'm not quite sure why that is, but I'll go into potential discussion about that method later. And then also, yeah, these ones didn't contain any psilocin or psilocybin. And I want to mention those last three there. There was a gummy sample and 2 liquid samples. So our method was designed for dried mushroom material. So it could be that those last 3 did contain psilocybin and psilocin. We decided to analyse them anyway, but our method might not have actually worked on them. So just putting that out there. Those first 3 didn't show that they contained any psilocybin or psilocin, which is surprising because they look very similar to the other samples. So it just shows you can't necessarily tell what you are taking just by looking at it. So more results. I also in my project had a qualitative interview component. That's a whole separate talk, but the main thing that came out of that I just want to highlight is that people were primarily microdosing for mood improvement, which is interesting because a lot of other literature globally finds not only are people motivated by mood improvement, but also cognition and creativity. So that was really interesting. I'll keep the psychological results very brief for timing, and I can go over it more later if you want to catch me at the conference, but we did look at a few things like depression, anxiety and stress, neuroticism, which were lower in people who microdose, and then things like nature-relatedness, openness and extroversion were higher in people who microdose relative to non-microdoses. And also I know this is observational, so placebo, correlation doesn't equal causation, all of that. But importantly, I wanted to look at people who were microdosing on a consumption day versus a non-consumption day, and then also if there were differences in people who were taking what they thought and people who were not taking what they thought. And unfortunately, we got a very, very low sample size for both of these, and so we didn't get anywhere near statistical power. But there was no differences. Well, there was a trend towards no differences from people on a consumption day versus non-consumption day, and there was a slight trend towards perhaps better mood outcomes compared to for those people who were taking what they expected compared to those who weren't. But again, very low sample size. Hopefully this research will start the ball rolling on future research using drug checking. But yeah, that's a future direction. So yeah, as I mentioned, there were differences in the between groups comparison, which were consistent with some of the wider observational literature on microdosing. And I want to note also there are some discrepancies in the findings for things like, for example, neuroticism and creativity in observational microdosing literature. There's a lot of reasons why this could be, but I want to point out maybe studies done in different countries maybe likely have a different supply of illicit substances. Maybe that could explain some of those differences, but again, this is speculation. It could be a number of reasons. Whether these results are specific to people who microdose in New Zealand who didn't come forward for this study, that's something future research will hopefully determine as well, once there's more trust of drug checking legislation and its legitimacy. So to discuss the drug checking outcomes, LSD outcomes were consistent, but I want to note there that's not necessarily going to be indicative of the future supply of LSD in New Zealand. It could change in the future. That's the nature of the illicit market, unfortunately. And with psilocybin, so that second point there, past research extracting psilocybin and psilocin shows these ranges of percentages. And I also just want to mention the Denver, Colorado Psychedelic Cup. Some of you might be familiar with that. And so what it is so in Denver, Colorado, mushrooms are legal to possess, grow and consume, and they hold an inaugural psychedelic cup where people can grow their own mushrooms, and the goal is the winner will have the highest concentration of psilocin. So the highest concentration of psilocybin was 3.14% in the 2023 competition. We found percentages of psilocybin between 3.5 and 8.8%, which is obviously a lot higher. And so either New Zealand just has really strong, potent mushrooms, or there was a flaw in our method, which could be a possibility because we ran our method twice with our samples, with the samples that we were able to do that with. Sometimes, for example, first it showed those concentrations, but then the second time we ran it, it showed 0%. And so maybe our method needs further refinement. And so to conclude, my research does demonstrate drug checking can be used in research, and it bridges that gap in microdosing literature where we don't actually know what people were taking. Also, it shows drug checking can be used to inform evidence-based policy and safer drug use and harm reduction. And I hope drug checking is utilised in research in the future to study other substances too. And so, as I was talking about the mushroom method, hopefully there'll be more methods or hopefully more research in the future on this extraction method to analyse what people are taking for mushrooms. And there's actually another PhD student in my lab following on from my work using drug checking for a mushroom-specific project. So I'm very excited to see what comes out of that. And then future research should also see maybe if there's differences psychologically between people taking what they expect relative to those who are not, hopefully with a larger sample size than I got with my study. So thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate it. And I also just really want to thank again my supervisors and to those who helped me with all the laboratory work and the ANRG lab, and which is the lab group I'm in at Auckland University, and also of course all the participants who came forward to participate in my research. I couldn't have done it without them. So yeah. There's some references, but thank you.